So welcome back to our deep dive discussion into poetry. Last month we discussed how to write acrostics.
That's across.
Across from where?
This time we are picking up on a thread based on something I mentioned last month about ancient Near East poetic styles. Psalm 119 in the Bible is a sort of acrostic style poem. We don't see it in English, but the first letter of each section starts with the corresponding letter in the Hebrew syllabary, such as Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. Man, I miss good Doctor Who. Who's it? We aren't talking sci-fi now, we're talking poetry. So picking up on that thread, this month I want to introduce you to one of my favorite poetic styles, the ghazal. Ghazals are a form of song-like or prayer-like forms originating from ancient Persia. Like an ode, ghazals can be amatory, often themed with topics of spiritual or romantic love, or like the elegy, they can express the loss or separation from one's beloved and the beauty of love in spite of the pain. They originally stemmed from the 7th century AD, around the time of the expansion of Islam around the known world at the time, and 5 centuries later made their way into India. Etymologically, the word comes from an Arabic root meaning to sweet talk or to flirt. Wow. The history and how the poetic form spread over such a vast distance from Arabia to Africa to Spain to India is incredibly interesting. Different cultures and linguistic groups have added their flourishes to the style, adding to the uniqueness of this poetic form. Just like with all written works of art, the art form itself evolves and adapts to the whims of poets and writers creating them. Ghazals are structured into couplets, 2-line verses, and usually as long as 5 to 15 couplets called bait or sher. The couplets themselves are independent from one another, but are commonly linked either by theme or strictly because of the poetic structure. But it is given to a variety of expression. However, a true ghazal should have no less than 5 baits and no more than 15. Now, like with the acrostic, or better yet, the meditation, the ghazal has a focus threaded throughout its couplets. The way it was taught to me is that this word or phrase becomes a refrain, repeated at the end of each line in the first couplet, and then gets repeated at the end of the even-numbered lines in each subsequent couplet. So lines 1 and 2, 4, 6, etc. You can include rhyming, but it isn't required. The final stanza or couplet is allowed to have a self-referential statement somewhere in the line. So if you'd like an example, here's my example from my book of poetry, The Lover, the Fighter, and the Philosopher. It is called Warrior.
Warrior. From my first breath, I have prepared, trained, and lived as a warrior. I set myself apart with the mental and physical conditioning of the warrior. The earth, rotating and rotund, orbits, flows, fights, pushing through gravity like a warrior. Fire illuminates and radiates, kisses and caresses with the passion and commitment of a long-lost warrior. Air breathes in and about this mystery we call life, a force of power filling the lungs of every man, woman, and warrior. Water, the element of life, of liquid thought and fluid feeling, ebbs and flows. Each quenches the thirst and replenishes the cool raw power of the warrior. With sword and shield, with fervent ambitious drive, war is waged, the dueling emotions of peace versus fight in the heart of the warrior. Now gun and grenade, bomb and bayonet live in his hands, shooting, fragmenting, detonating, and piercing as the new tools of the warrior. Honor, nobility, truth, justice, courage and fearlessness, which are very different. These existed as the traits and talents of an authentic, traditional, old-fashioned warrior. Opportunism. The profiteering from war replaces self-sacrifice, the willingness to die protecting the lives of others, and an itchy trigger finger replaces a calm and steady blade, forever changing the image and direction of the warrior. The gracious God's spear-carrying champion where hawks fly is my true name, though I choose Altair ibn La'ahad, flying one, son of none, as I embrace the antiquated position of warrior.
Here are 5 tips for poets wanting to write a ghazal. Tip number 1. Your poem is typically going to be about love. This could either be romantic love or it could be love of the divine. It's not uncommon for an intersection between these two themes in ancient Near East poetry. Making another biblical reference, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon is a collection of Jewish erotic poetry that intertwines those two themes of romantic love and love of the divine. While it was collated thousands of years before the Ghazal, you can see how similar cultures influence one another and their poetic styles. Now, while my poem did not include these particular themes, there are references to God in at least one of the couplets. If the divine isn't your particular style, go with something romantic like I did with another ghazal in my book, and look back at some of the romantic tips that I mentioned when we first discussed sonnets back in February. Tip number 2, pay close attention to the structure. Your ghazal should have stanzas written in 2-line couplets, and the poem itself should have no less than 5 stanzas and no more than 15. For those of you trying to do the math at home, that's 10 to 30 lines. My ghazal, Warrior, was a total of 6 couplets or 12 lines. The couplets must be end-stopped, meaning each line must be ended with a period or an exclamation point or maybe even a question mark. While your theme is threaded throughout the entirety of the poem, each couplet should be able to stand on its own in regards to the theme. Now, I will admit that because of the variety that can be applied to this particular style, having the first line of your couplet ending in a semicolon or a comma can be done, especially if you are juxtaposing 2 different ideas connected to your overarching theme. Tip number 3, you need to include your focus word or phrase throughout the entire poem. It must show up at the end of lines 1 and 2, and then it needs to show up at the end of every subsequent even-numbered lines, i.e. lines 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. You cannot change it up, and you cannot have a variation on it. It must remain consistent. Tip number 4, if you can work it in, add a self-referential phrase to the final couplet of the poem. Many writers of this style do this as a way of signing their work. This makes sense, especially when you consider that this type of poem was either used as a prayer to God or as a love letter. Many contemporary or current ghazal writers tend to avoid this, but to be fair, it's kind of fun. While I didn't use my name directly, I did use the etymological description of my name as my self-reference. Finally, tip number 5, have fun with this. While it is traditional to have each line in a given couplet to have the identical number of syllables, if contemporary writers can eschew the self-reference, then don't feel too bad about changing up the length of your lines and syllable count to stamp your own identity into the poem as much as possible. So that's it. Make your poem about love, either romantic love or love of the divine. Pay close attention to the poem's structure. Include your focus word or phrase in both lines of the first stanza and at the end of every subsequent even-numbered line. If you're able to work it in, put in a self-reference, and finally, just have fun writing out this poem. I would love to see what you guys come up with at home. Write out your poem, and if you're interested, share it down in the video comments, or you can email it to me at gkjpublishing@gmail.com, or you can share it with me on Instagram and X at gkj_publishing. I would love to read it and offer you feedback.